All right, well, Jay Willie, I guess this is convenient
Bye
because
bye.
I think now we can transition to the second part of this, which I'm gonna upload as like a separate thing, so that'll be like a convenient timestamp. And we're at like about the 1 hour mark, so I think that's a good I guess pre-stream for it. Um, but yeah, so the idea was that Jen will potentially have a debate, and Pilleater, you're technically the moderator, but I think if
Okay.
it ends up just being a discussion, then like your input would probably be interesting too. So
Yeah, sure.
it is whatever it is. But basically, so the idea with ethics, morality, and aesthetics that I have that I kind of briefly sketched out at the beginning of the stream here is that I distinguish between ethics and morality. Ethics is based on the non-aggression principle, and it's mostly just concerned with not violating anyone else's property rights. And this covers all of the big stuff, right? Don't steal from people, don't murder them, that kind of thing. But it doesn't really mandate that you do anything particularly good, which is where libertarians kind of end up having this issue where like we're all stereotyped as being a bunch of like hedonistic people, which is it's kind of an image libertarians have sort of like embraced from like a humorous perspective. But then the question is like, well, what do you do about having a good life, right? And then that's where morality comes into play. And then what is a good thing to pursue for one person? That's I think where we have the subjective nature of things, which I would put into a separate category from ethics, which is morality. So I maintain that there's kind of a clear distinction between the two. However, it does seem to be the case that for most people, when they pursue things that are morally good for them, there's some synergy with leading like an ethical life. Um, but then basically the realm of aesthetics is also morality, and I think this seems strange, but when you think about the way we use language, you know, typically with aesthetics, the first thing people think of is visual art. They think of paintings and drawings and stuff like that. They think of colors and like whatever. But then we think about it a little more and we realize, well, music is part of aesthetics. And then we think, oh, well, that was a beautiful thing to do. That's a beautiful way of life, right? We expand this idea of beauty to mean not just visual art, but all forms of art, including performance art, including how you live your life and things like that. And that's why I think it's not that much of a stretch for us to say that morality and ethics are actually two terms for sorry, morality and aesthetics are two terms for the same thing. So that's kind of how I sketch it out, which is it's very very similar to how Molyneux puts it in universally preferable behavior. And then Jen, I think your take on it has some similarities, but also some like major departures.
Cool. Yeah. Do you want me to just go over real quick what I think?
Yeah, yeah. Do your own rant, and then we'll see. I guess if there's any, we'll see if there's any clash.
Sounds good. So we have to first define what we mean by morality because I think everybody sort of has an inclination as to what it means. And most people think about stuff like the golden rule when they talk about morality. It's basically some consideration given to the effects of your actions on other people, as in seeking to minimize the harm that your actions do to other people. That informs morality to some extent. So I'm actually going a step further and I'm defining morality as that which minimizes the suffering universally. And it's not certainly not self-evident what does that because, as we've seen from practical pseudo implementations of this type of ideology, it can easily lead to hedonism, which doesn't actually minimize suffering. And you could even argue that hedonism in the long run increases suffering because you're kind of like living a empty, meaningless existence, and you have to take drugs and you know do all these degenerate sexual acts just to get a kick or whatever. So I'm talking about like scientifically validated ways of minimizing suffering, such as learning mathematics or philosophy or religion, and basically building up virtue. So I basically put morality into two categories. One is you can't, like, there should be forbiddances on harmful acts, so which is where you get the like Molyneux type, rape is bad, MK type stuff. So it's basically a list of stuff that would be not allowable by law. And then the other side of morality is how does one increase virtue, which is essentially a different question, because the absence of a bad act is not the same thing as the presence of a good act. So if you obey the forbiddances, i.e. you don't do the things that are forbidden, that doesn't make you virtuous. It sort of makes you neutral. To be virtuous, you actually have to build that virtue up. And so the way I define morality is basically how built up someone's virtue is. And the way that I've formally systematized that on my blog is to say that ideologies, which are the things that cause people to do the behavior that they do, it forms their beliefs, basically. Ideologies fall on a spectrum between R and K, which is this model about carrying capacity, and it can be extended to animals as being either R selected or K selected, and humans are on the K end relative to other animals, but relative to each other, humans can be more on the R end and more on the K end, and we see evidence like as to what end they're at based on their group behavior, such as reproduction rate, civilizational longevity, overall vibe of people, like are people depressed, are they happy, are they healthy, and so forth. And so my argument is basically the more K-selected the ideology, the more moral it is. And the more people can embody this ideology, the more moral they are. So that's basically my link between morality and aesthetics, because what I'm saying is essentially that you can recognize whether an ideology is R or K-selected based on its aesthetic. So it's essentially saying that beauty and morality are connected. So that's my argument.
Okay, so the major difference then is that for you it's a strictly objective matter, whereas when I put aesthetics in the realm of morality, I'm making it strictly subjective based on the individual. Although I guess it kind of depends, right? Because if it's relative to how R versus K selected they are, then in that sense, is it subjective or not? I guess I hate those terms because I kind of view everything as objective fundamentally.
Subjectivity is a thing. We have we can't ad hoc assume we're even able to know what objective things even are, because we have this like lens of subjectivity that we perceive everything through. So our sort of default position is that, yeah, we're subjective. But because we have these convergences as to what people agree is beautiful, that implies that there is some objective component that tells us that there is something as there does exist such a thing as beauty that we are all recognizing in our own way. And the answer to that is symmetry. We recognize symmetric things as beautiful. And there's a whole bunch of theory to this in art. If you look into it, there's like, proportionality, and there's different rules for like how many objects should be in a scene in order to make it look balanced and so forth. And that essentially reduces to a problem of contrast. So the two things that predict beauty are contrast and symmetry, which is why you can have people that look radically different, but that most people will agree they're beautiful. And that's because you can pick out that they have extreme forms of symmetry and contrast. This is why women paint their eyebrows darker black. This is why they wear under eye liner. This is why they wear like a very bright red lipstick and so forth, because they're trying to enhance the natural contrast. And I don't think anyone's going to disagree that symmetry is beautiful. There's something about symmetric things that we find pleasing to the eye. And I think the argument for that is that essentially the planet favors a K-selected situation because it's a finite resource. And K-selected, what it means is that there's a symmetry between the consumption and the production of the biome. So essentially, whatever animals are living, the humans that are living, they are in balance with the environment. And so there's a connection between, like, there is an objective attribute to, there's an objectivity to beauty and morality. It's just that as subjective agents, we may not conceive of it all as the same thing, but we can all recognize beauty.
Okay, but then our mechanism for understanding reality, right? Like our means of perception and of reasoning, even though these might have subjective characteristics, fundamentally they're still based on like objective material reality, right? Like they can't arise from nothing.
Well, it's kind of like there's like two sort of, there's two sides to it. There's like, why are we here? Well, it's because we survived. Why did we survive? Well, we believe the things that were necessary for our survival, and we are evolved to be intelligent, which means we'll have the best approximation in our sensory faculties to the objective world, but it's not equal to the objective world. Just because we have very good senses doesn't mean that we can tell exactly what's going on in the objective world. And where that inversion takes place is where you get these complex philosophical questions like the conversation we're having right now, because it is not self-evident. Whereas something like, what color is that chair? That is a self-evident thing. We can agree on that. There is some portion of our perception that does reflect objectivity to the extent that we can agree as to what we're looking at.
Yeah, and that's like a classic philosophical thing. You just say, hey, like, what if my red is your blue and your blue is my red, right? One of those like fun little thought experiments. So okay, it looks like so what you do instead of making a distinction between ethics and morality, you make a distinction within morality. And what you call forbiddance is essentially what I'm talking about when I say ethics. One key point of departure is that you base your morality on minimizing harm, it sounds like, or based on consequences. Whereas for me, it's like it's deontological. It's like I actually don't care about the consequences. I like maintain this is morally absolutely correct. And even if it leads to like the destruction of all of humanity, I don't care because like these logical principles hold. And like on pain of contradiction, I will insist on the NAP, which I think it's a convenient kind of happy coincidence that when we adhere to the NAP, it tends to promote the minimization of harm, but it doesn't have to, especially when so much of harm is, I think, subjective. I think there is some variance there, right? So many trade-offs, and it is based on like your individual values.
Well, sure. Suffering is a subjective thing by definition, but there are aspects of suffering that we can objectively agree on. We can say, like,
because you mentioned like happiness, health, ability to reproduce, civilizational longevity.
Yeah, those are things that we have some means to measure, right? Like we can all agree that, drug addicted, homeless person, that's not an enviable position to be in because that person suffers a great deal, right?
Right.
So we can agree
but
that
for
suffering
me, it
is
wouldn't.
bad.
Yeah, it wouldn't
We can,
necessarily be based on their suffering, though. I guess
well,
would be one difference.
what would it be based on if not that?
It might be based on their predisposition to violate the other's rights. Or
Oh,
potentially based on an opportunity cost that they could be doing something that's more like productive or interesting or beautiful.
yeah, I guess I don't look at it that way. I think the main difference between the way we see things is it's a question of to what extent the state should involve itself in matters of morality. You seem to think that if there's like a basic list of forbiddances that everybody agrees to, that things will more or less happen on their own and it'll be positive and that the markets will take care of it. Whereas I disagree, and I think that there needs to be an active role taken on the level of philosophical and scientific purity. You basically need to have some type of anchor to reality by which other statements of fact are judged, because there's a huge issue with basically people believing different things and that causing a breakdown in communication. I think that's the main way in which I would depart from, standard NAP touting ANCAPs.
Right. Well, and I guess I appreciate that in advocating for the state, you at least acknowledge that it's an NAP violation. Because it seems like most of the conversations, people they're not willing to concede that, right? They're like
I don't think the state is a de facto NAP violator, because the problem I see is that people's minds. Okay, here's what the question your ideology doesn't answer. Whose property are people's minds? Who,
most
who
libertarians, I think, we tend to reject intellectual property.
okay, so it's basically outside of the domain of property.
Well, I
People's
mean, because you could,
individual.
in theory, enforce it through contract, but then it becomes just a matter of like the property and like your word in the contract, right? So like a lot of what IP does, you can just kind of achieve the same results by agreeing to contract. And then when you violate your contract, it hurts your credit and it hurts your ability to form future contracts, which is pretty similar to how IP works in practice now. But like we can make it all work without some separate conception of like your mind being property.
I think we need that concept, actually, because if we don't understand people's minds as being property, other people will, and they will seek to uh, change people's opinions to suit their own desires, which will impose a cost on the commons, which
Well, isn't
will
that just persuasion? Like we can't ban persuasion.
absolutely, you can do things like that.
Oh,
There
I
are
think that's
ways to
crazy.
curtail and
No, I'm sorry. I think that's crazy town. You can't ban persuasion.
well, you
What?
can definitely, you may not be able to ban persuasion, but you can curtail influence. For example, you can make it illegal for people to assert anything as true. They have to say it's an opinion, which will, that will actually go quite a long way, because
Oh,
when you
that's
have,
another big difference. I don't believe in opinion. I think all opinions are just like systems of fact statements. And if you really parse it out, you can always reduce opinions to just like a system of statements of fact.
well, that's not untrue, but there's a difference between something that is true, i.e., objectively true, and a subjective opinion. And when people confuse those two things, it causes basically cognitive dissonance between people's individual beliefs. And in order for society to be binded together and function the way it's supposed to, which is essentially like a machine, uh, people need to believe the same things in a way. Not the exact same things, but their foundational axioms have to line up. Because if they don't, they will never basically be able to form a consensus. And a consensus is necessary for people to basically buy into the idea that the state is capable of performing its basic duty, which is to arbitrate disputes of property rights. If it cannot do
Yeah.
that, if the state cannot perform that function in a manner which is perceived just by the lady will lose faith in the state, and the state will collapse, because the faith of the lady is the glue that binds the state together. If nobody believes in something, it's not happening, right? So I guess it's just a different philosophy, basically. Like, you seem to think that things, you seem to think you can know stuff before it's happened, like this idea of contracts, of making a contract on someone's mind and saying, well, you can only get influenced by this one person. But it doesn't really work like that in practice, because there's so much propaganda and people buy into that, and that creates problems.
Yeah, and I guess one thing I would concede is that like if I'm presented with the anarchy button, right? Which is like a thought experiment where we say, okay, if you press the button, the state gets eliminated the moment you press the button. I think yeah, that would absolutely result in disaster because like our civilizations right now are full of people who we're produced in statist societies, and therefore we're like not capable of basic things. Like we're too dumb to realize that like you can make roads work without government. So like obviously there is a question of like how do we move society in a way such that people could progress to the point where they're capable of existing without a state. I don't know how much further we have to go. Like I think I don't know. I don't think it's impossible. But I do think that there's probably versions of a quote unquote state that if they're not in violation of the NAP, those wouldn't like I guess I wouldn't count them as states. But then if you do, they would be under like my definition, like an ethically permissible state. And honestly, I think that when you think about ideas of like resolving disputes and having courts and enforcing contracts, you know, we're already living in a situation where like nobody trusts the government. Everybody hates the government, no matter where you are on the political spectrum. It's all garbage. It's all terrible. But you know, the world keeps on spinning, and we're still surviving, and things are still kind of semi okay or whatever. So it doesn't need to reach a utopian standard. And I think that adding competition, can only help it. I know that you're of the opinion that there's certain things that like you can't commodify, and I think that's probably like one of the major essential points of departure.
Well, there's certain things that people need but don't want. All right, this comes back to the arcade thing. Like people will sort of, if unguided, they'll tend towards a more R-selected expression of their desires because it's like a short-termism type thing. So
Do you
there's
think
a
that people
valid.
change? Like is a person kind of predestined toward their spot on the RK spectrum? And then, like, for them, they should be pursuing aesthetics and morality that, as far as, like, that they're virtue seeking, right? They should be seeking things that are, like, congruent with that? Or do you believe that, like, people who are more R selected have kind of a duty to try to move towards the K?
Uh, that's a really big question. I mean, okay, so
Because K is superior to R, right? Like that's what distinguishes humans from other animals.
K is more desirable because we live on a finite surface, and that's what K is the carrying capacity conditions. So since the Earth is finite, K is the essentially it's the only survival strategy that can make it long term. Because when you have an R selected apex predator, it will just completely consume the environment because that's what it does. I mean, that's their behavior. So the distinction that needs to be made is between master and slave morality because this is like a very poorly understood thing. And I think it might help answer some of the questions that you have about the role of the state in this whole big question here. And basically, not everybody can uh, practice master morality because it's very difficult and it requires taking responsibility for the outcome. And most people don't want to do that. They don't want to be responsible for the outcome of their actions. And practically speaking, it would be foolish to sort of give this, expectation to people. You should just aspire to master morality, and that's essentially the problem that democracy has. Is basically saying, well, everybody mashed together will give us the best possible outcome, but actually that's not true because the majority of people are essentially automatons with no inner voice and no desires past sleeping, eating, and fucking. So you have to basically divide people into categories of those who are capable and willing to practice master morality and those who are not. And morality for people who cannot practice master morality is essentially of a different flavor than those that can, because the slave morality has different axioms. Because if you're in this society that says, well, either you have to be responsible for the outcomes and practice master morality, or you have to not be responsible for the outcomes and practice slave morality, you make that choice. You're essentially doing a trade-off between time preference. You're saying, yeah, I would rather just be told what to do because I'd rather just, eat, sleep, and fuck, and that's my whole thing. Or I don't want to leave that to someone else. I want to be aware of why decisions are being made. I want to inform those decisions, and I want to, basically push civilization forward. And so the slave morality is basically all about obedience, submission, and trusting the class of masters, whereas master morality is about building knowledge and making laws. Because not every group can conform to the same laws, right? So the more advanced a group is, the more K-selected their state ideology can become, which involves more complex ritualism associated with virtue. And if people aren't able to memorize that ritualism, or it doesn't speak to them on a level where they're actually, like, you don't get the buy-in, well, then there's just, no hope to bring the civilization to this really high level. So it does depend on where people are at, but basically what you want to do is give people a stepping stone towards more virtue. At the very least, you don't want to allow their vice to spill out into the commons, basically. The consequences of their vice to spill into the commons, you don't want that. And at best, you want to sort of give them a roadmap towards more virtue and basically just meet them where they're at. So it's not really what people should do. It's more like, you tell me what you want your civilization to look like, and I will tell you what you have to do to get it. There's no objective should or shouldn't, because there's a certain neutrality. It's really just results-based, what you call reverse engineering.
Right. So it sounds like it's kind of like whatever society is, you're like prescribing what it is that might improve their health, and it's going to be different depending on where they're at. But then it sounds like also, like, ideally, is there this conception of a society where like everyone is like really really aggressively extremely K selected, and then they've all ritualized all of the absolute best things, and they're constantly moving toward the most virtue? Or do we then still have this R versus K spectrum just among people who are on average more K selected?
Well, you have to ask yourself, what's the limit of K selected?
Yeah, because that's like inconceivable to me. I don't know what that would mean at all. Like, because you can conceive of it in relation to someone who's highly R selected, right? But then, like, I guess it's got to be like transhumanist matrix shit or something. Like, it's something like, yeah, it's like almost inconceivable, you know?
Well, you have to define it step by step. The first step is the most obvious one, which is the reproduction rate. You want that to be, you don't want the population numbers changing much generation on generation. So you want, what is it, like 2.2 kids per family or something like that?
Yeah, you need enough to replace
You
the
need, you
parents,
need
and
that
then
at
like a couple of
that's like
extra for insurance.
that's a minimum. That's
Yeah,
the extra is because not everybody procreates, and I'll talk
right.
more about that later. But yeah, that's the bare minimum. So what gives us that? Well, number one, arranged marriages. Okay, and what gives arranged marriages the best chance of success? Well, it's a culture that values arranged marriages. What kind of culture is that? Well, we compare it with what we have right now, which is like this Hollywood sort of driven true love, whatever. It's kind of a bullshit lark, because most people don't find that, you know, Prince Charming or whatever, ride in the sunset, perfect marriage. It's a lot of work, and a lot of people aren't. They don't have enough virtue to put the work in to make it work, so it falls apart, and then it's not good for anybody, right? It just ends up being, the cool wine aunt drunk in her, one bedroom apartment with her cats, watching old episodes of Dharma and Greg, right? Like, that's not where, that's not the best case situation, right? So you have some type of culture that will see the value in arranged marriages. And the way I see that coming about is by making the main culture not revolve around sex or romance or what all this other crap. It has to revolve around knowledge and people caring about their status, because people are essentially status seeking. People caring about their status within this meritocratic philosophical knowledge type society that Plato would have alluded to. And that allows people to see marriage as more of a duty slash, it's a merging of assets, right? It's like, well, I could live alone, but this is better. Even though it's not ideal, it's an agreement between two people to build something together. And that has actually been shown to create a better society, both from the perspective of marriage longevity. Look at the Indians, they have the lowest divorce rate. The traditional, what's called Hindu Indians, who practice arranged marriages, less in the modern day, but this was basically the standard in the past. So that's a good comparator because they really did master civilization. And so that sort of informs it partially, but then you have to look at what are people doing day to day, and basically, are they enjoying participating in society? Do you get the buy-in from people to participate in the act of the creation and maintenance of civilization? And this essentially reduces down to two problems. One is channeling aggression, and the other one is fostering virtue. So channeling aggression, people are aggressive and animalistic in a way, and conflicts will arise. However, when these conflicts do arise, we don't want the resulting, violence to destroy the civilization in the process. So an advanced civilization has ways of mitigating these conflicts that arise spontaneously, either over resources or differences of opinion. So that's one thing that could be taken into consideration. The other one is the building of virtue, which in a lot of ways has to do with a question of how what you could call sterile drones are treated in the society. So people who do not procreate, but instead devote their life to fostering virtue by building knowledge. And if those people are treated well, then they're kind of like role models for everybody else. And that's not to say that everybody then becomes like a renunciate who doesn't practice marriage or anything. That those people are just there in a tiny minority to guide the process of civilization. If those people are honored, then the civilization goes a lot better. Even though that's kind of what you want. Like you want a high esteem for the people above you in the pecking order of status, but you don't want envy for them. So there's kind of a way to sort of shift things around so that you can look up to people above you without envying them, because the renunciates would live a life of austerity, and for people who are not interested in enlightenment, such a simple life would not appeal to them. So they wouldn't be jealous of these enlightened masters who were guiding civilization. They would just be happy that they were there. So society at the K limit has to be a cooperative effort, because any instance of non-cooperation makes the engine of civilization work less efficiently, basically.
Okay, so it sounds like then people, it's not that they're necessarily like you're born at a 20% on the R side versus a 50% right in the middle versus a near 80% on the K. Like born at that point, and it's that there's some flexibility there depending on each individual, but then it sounds like regardless, any society in order to progress, even if they're all moving towards a K ideal, whatever that could be objectively, there still needs to be moving parts on all ends of that spectrum for it to work.
Yeah, you basically need you need goals. Another way to look at it is hero worship. People need to feel like they have something to aspire to, because once you feel like you've done everything and you have nothing else to do, it's probably not a very good feeling, and that would make you not so invested in building civilization. So yeah, I do think it's a really big. Another big problem is that you talk about the state and people being degenerate in the modern day. I think the main reason for that is because people perceive the state as something that bestows rights, when really the way we should look at the state is something that we collectively build as a duty. That rights, is largely a fallacy. I don't want to say there's no such thing as rights, but they're human creation. There's no such thing as God-given rights.
Yeah, I'm not a fan of the whole positive rights theory, but all right. Well, honestly, I think that I don't know if there's a clear statement of resolution we can make it into a debate, but I'm kind of happy with it just being a discussion. And I am kind of curious to get thoughts from other people if there's anything they wanted to chime in on. I know Claire's blowing up our chat here. Claire, if you notice, if you type
Is Claire shitting up the
exclamation
chat?
point, huh?
Is Claire shitting up the chat?
Yeah, a little bit.
Oh my god.
Yeah, she's just well, she's asking some questions, so she's she's behaving as she does.
Are you gonna bring her on?
Um, I suppose we could. Yeah, Claire, if you wanna come on, I don't see why not.
I gotta unblock her off Hangouts first. Because if I don't block her, she just messages me like constantly, and it's like I can't do this, man. I got stuff to do.
Well, okay, because I feel like I don't know, Pilleater, because I know you've been sitting patiently as we talked at each other. If there is
He
any
did
like
say a minute
particular,
ago. He said a
huh?
minute ago BRB. I'm not actually sure if he's there. He
Oh,
said
I don't know if I
BRB.
saw that. Oh, okay. But yeah, I think we'll open up to be like a discussion because I think that's kind of the natural course of this. But it's interesting. Like I can see the conception you have of the RK and like wanting society to move in that way and making an appeal based on the consequences. I can see that as like a potentially persuasive argument. But I guess
Well,
like
think
you'd
of it
be
like this.
willing to use the state to motivate this, whereas I would say nope. Like you have to make the case and you have to get people to go on board with it. And even if people are a bunch of mouth breathing, knuckle dragging idiots, like so be it. That's what we have to deal with. And if people can't get on
I do
board,
want
then they're gonna have to just deal with it.
I do want that. I do want them to. I do want to get the buy-in. I do actually think I could get the voluntary buy-in. That's why I'm doing all this outreach work. Like I honestly think I could get people to buy into this because basically what I'm saying is that we have a situation of like abundance, right? We have all this consumer goods and all this media entertainment available to us. And what that's going to do is shift our thinking towards like a short termism, aka R selected. So if we don't do anything, things are going to go in an R selected direction. And we know from science that that's going to create an aesthetic that is unviable and eventual collapse of the state itself. So what I'm saying is you have to put work into the system of civilization in order to get it going in a K direction. I'm not saying I can transpose where we're at right now to perfect K enlightenment wonderfulness. What I'm saying is I can put people on a path now based on where they're at that will eventually get them closer and closer towards this ideal because we're going to ban the things that we know undermine the achievement of this ideal and we're going to make knowledge available that will enable people to either study independently or in a collective in order to get closer to the virtue required to push that as far towards the K end as possible. There's essentially no end to it, right? Because like, what's the best possible society? It's like it's unfathomable because we're not advanced enough to sort of conceive of it, but we know that it's there. It just might take a bit of time to develop it. But the first step in that is the philosophical rearrangement and understanding that the state is something we have a duty to uphold. It's not something that owes us gibs.
Right. Yeah. Go like we're too far from the finish line to be able to see it so far, but we can still see that the path.
Well, you can look at some of the previous achievements of humanity. Like there's amazing underground castles in India, and it's like humans built those. Somehow they were so well organized that they were able to build these things collectively that endure since antiquity, and they're really quite impressive. Like they're unparalleled feats of engineering.
Since you mentioned ancient things built by brown people, I have to make the obligatory counter theory that it could have been ancient aliens.
Yeah, aliens, right. Actually, I don't think it's possible for aliens to come here. I think aliens probably exist, but I don't. I think just based on entropy, I don't think that it's possible to travel. Like, I don't think space travel over long distances is really possible for entities complex enough to build said technology. Like, we're highly specialized to this environment. We don't do very well in space. Bones start to decay and stuff. So other aliens, would say aliens to this planet, other life forms would face the same problem. And we
So
know that.
that's your workaround to the Femry paradox.
Well,
Is their
think that
bones would just break.
I think that the aliens, like ancient aliens, is basically another diversionary tactic like ancient Aryans being white. It's just like misinformation to make it harder for people to understand human history and therefore harder for them to build civilization and easier for them to be enslaved.
I could see that.
Do you believe in
Fliegen.
aliens? Like, do you think there could be aliens here now?
Oh, I think there have to be aliens somewhere. But I don't know why they haven't made it to Earth yet. I think probably because none of them embrace libertarianism. That's probably the number one reason. But I think that's one of the theories, right? Is that they always end up like destroying themselves before they would reach the point. Or maybe I don't know, like is space travel really that productive or worthwhile compared to the alternatives?
Um,
Like not enough people are asking that question. We just assume that like, oh, the next planet's got to be the next thing, and it's like I don't know. Antarctica's pretty big.
yeah, you're right. An advanced civilization wouldn't have any interest in space travel because they would know that it was like, where are you going to go, right? I mean, I just don't think people realize how vast these differences are. Like Mars is the next planet, and it's pretty darn far, and it's pretty hard to get out to Mars, and we don't have anything on Mars. We don't have much on the moon. You know what I mean? Like, it's a very hostile environment. That's the thing that people don't seem to understand. Like, they seem to think that this technology that's going to enable space travel is just around the corner, but actually we have this thing called the Carnot engine, which essentially places a hard limit on the mechanical efficiency that an engine, a stroke engine, can possess. And so they say, well, we have to invent some other type of technology. But it's like, no, the Carnot engine is defined as being the most efficient engine. I mean, it's not even possible now to build a Carnot engine. It's just like the limit of efficiency. And so knowing that, and knowing how much fuel you would need to go a certain distance, and knowing that that fuel would have a certain weight to it, so you'd have to have more fuel just to transport the fuel, which creates sort of a problem of like needing infinite fuel to displace infinite fuel.
Yeah, we might need a series of space elevators. That might be the that might be the workaround. Complex network of space stations and space elevators. But the problem is, before we invent anything like that, obviously we're gonna perfect the matrix, and then like that's always gonna be preferable. I feel like, so maybe that's the reason that the aliens never reached here. Is why come visit here when they already have the matrix and everything's perfect or whatever.
Yeah, basically, what would they want from us? They would either want to take our stuff, or they would want to, I don't know,
Or to trade.
trade or come and, I don't know, teach us what they knew, maybe. I mean, I can't imagine. I don't understand the fixation with aliens, frankly. I think that, yeah, life probably exists on other planets because all you need is liquid water for life to arise, but that doesn't mean that they're going to, people have to realize, like, it took 4 billion years for humans to arise, and we're still not that smart. We're smarter than any other animal, but we're not, like, you know what I mean? Okay, Pilleater just said he's back, so I think he's been gone that while.
Oh yeah, Pilleater.
But
We opened up to a more general conversation. Fliegen in the chat said this veered off from aesthetics a bit, which kinda. But we previously established that literally everything's related to aesthetics, so I think we're in the clear.
Well, I just wanted to cover notes what I had. Well, I was learning earlier that Jen was talking about symmetrical as beauty. That I thought it was ideologies are actually R versus K strategy. I'm not so sure if Space Pan agreed with that. And there's a breakdown of communication, and then the persuasion, band persuasion. Like those, I think, are kind of the things I'm getting from Jen's side, and Space Pan being more freeform and liberal about things.
Sorry, I was eating a snack. I should admit it.
Well, it's interesting because I never thought of ideologies as something to do with Rushton's R versus K strategy, as I find that interesting in some weird comparison study.
Yeah,
Yeah,
I
I
guess.
did an article on it. You can read it in full if you're interested. I'll put it in the chat. It's an interesting question because when you talk about morality, I mean, people will talk about morality a great deal, but then they won't. They're shy to define it. It turns out to be actually pretty difficult to define.
Yeah, because for me, like the number one priority is getting people on board with the what you would call the forbiddances, right? Which is just the basic ethical things that we should be not doing. And then the way I see it is that, a society where like this bare minimum line is everybody being neutral, that's like the fundamental focus. And then I kind of like to me it's largely unimportant how people define their own morals, and that I don't prescribe to people,
Is this
what
more of a
direction they should go in. And then because of that, I guess I have little to say about
is it
aesthetics and morality.
an objective versus subjective argument, as Jen's taking more of the objective and Space Pan's more subjective, especially that Jen was saying that living can be unbalanced with the environment, and Space Fans like don't care about the consequences. Even if you do this, you know what right is, and that's what I'm trying to get from this. Actually, is just two different ways of thinking about things.
Yeah, well, because for example, like there's like balance in the environment. Well, the environment's always changing by definition, right? So we don't really have that doesn't really give us much of an objective matter. Who's to say that the way we change or manipulate the environment is more or less preferable necessarily? I suppose you could do it based on things like our health and like our happiness or whatever, but then, what is happiness? And even what is health to some degree. But then the other thing too is, sorry, what was it?
That's why you have to look at it as the minimization of suffering, because you can't be like, well, go get happiness, because it's just like, well, how? The only way to be happy is enlightenment. Most people don't have what it takes to achieve enlightenment.
But wait a minute, if most people don't have that, then I guess then isn't that a little bit that's
It's
kind of
not
a problem,
contradic-
isn't
it's not,
it?
it's not contradictory. No, it's not contradictory, because the way we look at it is that eventually people will come to the conclusion through their own experience that enlightenment is the way to go. But we also understand that we can't rush that process. All we can do is essentially put the guardrails up and say, okay, lemmings, don't run off the cliff, don't run off the civilizational cliff. Do what you got to do, but do it within confines that don't destroy civilization and the environment. And then when you decide through your own experience that you want to go in the direction of enlightenment, there will be a community there available for you to join. It's just that having it there is what gives the comfort. If you
I
try to
guess
say, come on, man, don't you want to be enlightened, man? It gives off a desperation that self-respecting people just wouldn't want to be associated with. That's why I'm against proselytizing.
okay. Right. So it has to be, I guess, done in a way. But the issue I'm seeing is that like there's more than one way that we can move from R toward K as a society, right? Like you kind of have a series of different tools, whether it's arranged marriages or like prioritizing knowledge or banning things that are harmful, right? Though there's like a series of things that you can try, right?
You got to do them all at the same time.
You have
It's
to do
just
all of them
like,
at the same time. So what if, for example, we have like an R selected like status quo, and then like we have like different like clones of it, right? And some of them choose a few of the strategies, and some of them choose different strategies, and then they're progressing in different directions towards different Ks.
okay.
So
Uh,
this creates a
yeah,
problem then, right? Because then we don't have a spectrum
no,
anymore.
not necessarily, no. I mean, you could theoretically have, quote, different Ks, but I don't see those living in the same region, because believing different things leads eventually to conflict and
Yeah, they can be
destruction.
separate. They can be separate Kano states. Like
But
Claire
look at
mentioned in
look
the
at Japan.
chat.
Look at Japan versus India. You could argue that traditional Japan and traditional Indian society were both very K selected, but they were they had a different aesthetic. But you could draw parallels between their aesthetics, but they're not identical, right? So that, yeah, you could
Right.
have
And then
different
this goes
Ks.
back to your problem of contrast.
Well, they would both have contrasts, but those contrasts would be relative to the environment in which they arose and the people that arose them, right? Because the Japanese or the Indians are different people, like genealogically, so they're going to see things differently, and they have a different environment. So, like in Japan, you get geishas and samurai, whereas in India you get Brahmins and so forth. So it's different, but it's the underlying mechanism is the same. You're looking at an attitude within the citizenry of building civilization and the idea of duty as it relates to statecraft, and also the idea of different people performing different duties based on their preferences and capacities.
So then, would you have a way, like, let's say we have this like Olympic competition between all the societies of who's the most case selected. Do we have a measure for like fairly quantifying who's the most case selected when we're also dealing with the environments and the people and the cultures being still different, even if there's
You would,
parallels?
you'd need to agree on a metric. So first of all, we have to define, if you're going to accept the metric, what does it have to look like? I would argue the best metric is the knowledge which can be proven to be valuable. What knowledge does a civilization possess that can be scientifically proven to be valuable? And things like, what is the environment looking like? Like, are there a bunch of, totally destroyed ecosystems and, raised forests and, purple lakes, or are things, more in balance and animals are thriving and so forth? There's a lot of ways you could look at it. I don't know why you'd want to have this competition, because I think it's better to have the competition be exclusively within the group, because competing with other external ideologies is, I don't know why you'd want to do that. I suppose you could.
Well, because I'm trying to cause a problem for your theory. I'm trying to throw wrenches at you. But I can see how if you're doing it like within one society, right? That then you're controlling for a lot of those like differences, such that it becomes, I think, a little easier to measure it. But like I could see how, for example, like you could argue our current society is very R selected, but in terms of knowledge, technically I think more of it's available now than ever before, even though we're so R selected. It's not necessarily been transmitted to every single person, right? But it's technically out there, right?
We have more information available than ever before, but we also have less knowledge. Knowledge and information are different.
What's
Knowledge
the
is
key difference
the key
between the
difference
two?
is that knowledge is a method, whereas information is just a list of facts. We've got tons of lists of facts, but we don't have any real knowledge which allows us to go through the facts and tells us which of these facts is important and why. That's where we're really lacking. We
So we
lack
could
a
say knowledge is kind of like applied intelligence.
Yeah, that would be a good definition. Like, look at even something as objective, quote unquote, as quantum physics. Quantum physics has a crisis, okay? Like, they have not been going in the scientific direction for almost 100 years now. So what you have is a situation where you have more information, i.e. we have more devices making measurements than ever before, but we're more divided as to what those measurements mean than ever before, which creates a problem philosophically, because we can't, the way that philosophy advances is through debate. And the way that debates can happen is when you agree on axioms. You can't really debate a subject without agreeing to the axioms, and we're at a point where people don't even understand, A, what their axioms are, or B, what their axioms mean. So we have a lot of information, not very much knowledge.
Okay, I guess I can kind of see that distinction. So we want to go based on knowledge specifically, not just pure information.
It's more than just knowledge too. It's how the knowledge affects the civilization. Because if one person has perfect knowledge but doesn't tell anybody, it doesn't really affect civilization much. It's a
So it needs to be
combination.
pervasive also. You need knowledge and it has to be like it has to be both deep and wide.
Exactly. Because civilization is one big thing.
One thing
It's
that Claire had mentioned in the chat that I wanted just to bring out, because it's simple, and I think it does have some potential for clarifying things. That she said, if your parents are married, you're K selected. If not, you're R selected. Which
that's just
I think
stupid. Like
I
Claire's
think is a bit reductionist, but I
well,
think there's some utility in that.
she's just trying to redefine things to suit her worldview, right? So she's guilty of the cherry picking fallacy here. Interestingly, I got Claire to admit that she doesn't understand logic at all. Because I asked her to tell me what she understands about logic, and she had nothing, except for some reason, sound versus valid arguments. She was really sticking to that, but I was laughing because she's not able to do logic. Some people just can't do it. Like it
No, that's
requires
been my experience actually. I was a TA for logic, and I was trying to. I had like the socialist friend in college, and he was like, "I don't understand this logic," and I was trying to explain it to him, like trying to like tutor or teach him, and I just realized like I can't. There's no way I can explain this. Like if you don't, if I'm showing it to you, it doesn't click. There's like it's like there's nothing you can do, and like I feel like math is so much that way, but logic in particular. Not to imply that Claire's necessarily I won't. I'm not gonna throw any shade, but Claire, I'll toss you the link too, because I just in case you want to hop in here. Since we're talking about you, I figure it would be rude not to, and because it might be interesting. But yeah, I guess I'm not sold on the idea that K is necessarily like objectively aesthetically preference. Okay, because it sounds like there's enough packaged in here that you could make the case that R versus K even has a subjective nature to it. Because I can see alternative paths for different Ks, even if they're separate, right? And I think that kind of opens the door for like an individual preference towards one or the other, such
yeah,
that
that's
even if we're
called aesthetic preference. Aesthetic preference is actually a little bit different from RK. Aesthetic preference is just like what you happen to prefer, and there are some cases where your own preferences don't inform the degree of R or K selected, i.e., like, what's your favorite color? Well, mine's purple and mine's blue. Well, that doesn't inform anything about where they are on the spectrum, right? So there is such a thing as a subjective declension where you're just kind of saying it's no better or worse, it's just I prefer this to that. And that's what I call aesthetic preference. I consider that to be outside of the domain of morality. However, it is possible to link them, but it's essentially it's answering a different question.
Yeah, so that might be another difference then too, is that I'm using the term aesthetics in a much more broad way, which like the way I use aesthetics, it would encompass this discussion on like R versus K selection and things, whereas I think your use of the word is probably closer to what most people mean by it, which is more of a focus on like artistic expression on things like color and shape, like whether it's visual or oral or whatever form of artistic expression.
Well, it's basically how things look, right? Like there are some people who have blonde hair and blue eyes that we can all look at them and agree that they're beautiful. And then there's other people who have very dark hair and dark eyes and we can look at them and all agree that they're beautiful. But can we look between these two specimens and say this one is more beautiful than the other? I don't really think we can because they're beautiful essentially for different reasons. The underlying reason is always contrast and symmetry. But there are multiple ways contrast and symmetry can arise.
Well, I guess if we have an objective standard, though, I would just say if it's a man,
But
whichever one looks
is
more
the
like Paul Joseph Watson is superior, and if it's a woman, whichever one looks more like Melania Trump is superior. That would be my proposed objective standard. And then eventually, if we have our perfect case selected society, eventually we will all evolve into a society where all of the men are Paul Joseph Watson and all the women are Melania Trump.